Imagine walking into an emergency room and finding a man bleeding heavily from his groin. He claims he performed surgery on himself, but then whispers that two strangers cut into him, live-streamed the operation, and threatened to kill him if he ever told the truth. That was the terrifying reality that confronted doctors in Oklahoma in October 2020. This wasn't just a case of violence. It was something far darker, something most of us couldn't imagine in our worst nightmares. What began as a desperate patient seeking help quickly spiraled into a chilling investigation of underground surgeries, cannibalistic threats, and a cabin in the woods hiding horrors no one expected. The man who showed up that day was in his late 20s. At first, he tried to convince staff that his injuries were self-inflicted, a story that fell apart within minutes. No medical professional could believe what they were seeing had been caused by someone working alone. With a bit of coaxing, the victim admitted the truth. He had willingly agreed to an underground castration carried out by two men he met online. But what should have been a bizarre, if tragic, story of body modification soon revealed itself to be something much more sinister. The name at the center of it all was Bob Lee Allen, a 53-year-old man who presented himself as an expert in gender reassignment surgeries. His partner, Thomas Evan Gates, was by his side. According to the victim, Bob didn't just perform the procedure. He bragged about storing body parts in his freezer, hinted at cannibalistic tendencies, and threatened to kill the man and his loved ones if he ever went to the authorities. For police and investigators, this was unlike anything they had ever dealt with. It wasn't just a crime. It was a descent into a hidden world that mixed obsession, cruelty, and spectacle. And it all started with a man who believed he had found someone willing to help him, only to discover he had walked straight into a nightmare. What investigators would uncover inside Bob and Thomas's secluded cabin would shock even the most seasoned officers. And the story of how they got there begins with one fateful meeting online. To understand how this disturbing story unfolded, we need to go back to where it began, on the internet. The victim, whose name has never been publicly released, had been searching online for unregulated castration services. It sounds unbelievable, but there are dark corners of the web where communities form around extreme body modification. That's where he found Bob Lee Allen. Bob presented himself as someone with experience. He boasted about 15 years of working in gender reassignment procedures and even showed off videos he claimed were proof of his skills. To a vulnerable man who believed he'd finally found someone to carry out his wishes, Bob must have looked like the answer. But behind the promise of expertise was a man with erratic behavior and deeply unsettling intentions. Bob wasn't operating in secret isolation. On social media, he lived openly with his partner, 42-year-old Thomas Gates. Their posts painted a confusing picture. On one hand, they celebrated their wedding by live-streaming it online for family and friends. On the other, Bob posted odd, disturbing videos where he appeared intoxicated and made bizarre, self-degrading remarks. There was even footage of him staging a funeral for his pet dog, turning grief into something theatrical and unnerving. It didn't stop there. Bob also advertised his secluded cabin in southeast Oklahoma as an Airbnb rental, calling it Bob's Weekend Wonders. For just $45 a night, visitors could stay in a rustic, wooded setting, completely unaware that the same location was being prepared for something horrifying. To the outside world, Bob and Thomas might have seemed eccentric but harmless. Yet when the victim connected with them, Bob began laying out his conditions for surgery. The castration, he said, would be free of charge, but there was a catch. The entire operation would be live-streamed online, generating revenue from viewers who tuned in to watch. And the removed body parts? Bob insisted they'd be kept in his freezer. The victim, already committed to the idea of the surgery, agreed. He booked a flight to Dallas, where Bob met him at the airport. From there, they drove for hours into the woods of Oklahoma, toward a cabin that looked like nothing more than a weekend retreat. But what awaited inside was the beginning of a nightmare that no one could have prepared for. On October 11, 2020, the victim arrived in Dallas after flying in from Virginia. At the gate, Bob Lee Allen was waiting. Together they began the long drive to Bob's secluded cabin in southeast Oklahoma. What seemed like a strange adventure was about to become something far more terrifying. Bob offered the victim a bedroom for the night, promising that the procedure would take place the following evening. To someone who believed this was a consensual surgery, it may have felt almost clinical, but the reality was the complete opposite. On October 12th, at around 5 p.m., the operation began. Inside the cabin, Bob and Thomas prepared a wooden table draped with hospital gowns. There was no sterile operating room, no professional equipment, no proper anesthesia. Instead, Bob used only local numbing agents. That meant the victim was fully awake as the crude, 2-hour surgery unfolded. The victim later told investigators that Bob seemed to relish the act, laughing during the procedure and at one point calling himself a cannibal. He allegedly told the man that he might eat his body parts later, a claim that chills the spine even to repeat. Even more horrifying, Bob bragged about performing a similar operation in the past, on someone he described as crazy. According to Bob, he hadn't stitched that person's wounds, leaving them to bleed to death overnight. This wasn't just reckless surgery. It was cruelty dressed up as medical practice. The next morning, the victim awoke to excruciating pain and heavy bleeding. He drifted in and out of consciousness, begging Bob to take him to a hospital. Bob's response was chilling. No or no morgue. He refused to help at first, dismissing the man's desperate pleas. Eventually, for reasons that remain unclear, Bob relented. He and Thomas loaded the victim into their vehicle and drove toward McAllister Regional Hospital. But the threats didn't stop. Bob warned him that if he passed out or died during the drive, his body would simply be dumped in the woods. When they finally arrived, Bob instructed the victim to lie and say he'd done the surgery himself. Against all odds, the man survived. His courage to tell doctors the truth set in motion an investigation that would uncover horrors no one expected inside Bob and Thomas's cabin. When the victim revealed the truth at the hospital, doctors and nurses immediately knew this was beyond anything they could handle alone. They called 911, reporting that a man had been castrated in an underground surgery, live-streamed for an online audience. He was terrified, insisting that if he spoke out, his life and the lives of his loved ones were in danger. Law enforcement wasted no time. After taking the victim's statement, officers began building a case against Bob Lee Allen and his partner Thomas Gates. The victim described meeting Bob online, the drive to the Oklahoma cabin, the makeshift operating table, and Bob's disturbing comments about cannibalism. These details were enough for investigators to secure a search warrant. On October 15th, deputies arrived at the remote cabin. At first, the property looked deserted. The couple's vehicles were gone, and the cabin stood silent. But when officers forced their way inside, what they found was worse than anyone imagined. Inside a freezer, detectives discovered a plastic bag containing what appeared to be human testicles. Scattered around the cabin were surgical tools stained with blood, restraint straps, adult diapers, and an assortment of prescription drugs. Even more disturbing, investigators found storage devices that seemed to contain video recordings of various procedures. This wasn't just a one-time act. It looked like Bob and Thomas had been running a twisted operation for some time. While officers were still inside the cabin, searching for evidence, Bob and Thomas did something unexpected. They walked into the hospital apparently to check on the victim. Instead, they were met by police and immediately taken into custody. During questioning, Bob denied being a cannibal but admitted to performing the unlicensed surgery. His demeanor wavered between defiance and resignation. Thomas, who had assisted in the procedure, was also charged. The case against them was strong. Evidence from the cabin, testimony from the victim, and the physical proof of a crude operation gone horribly wrong. For investigators, the biggest question remained: how many others had been drawn into Bob's promises of underground surgeries? And were there victims out there who hadn't been as lucky as the man who managed to survive and tell his story? With the cabin search complete and Bob and Thomas in custody, the case moved swiftly through the courts. Prosecutors charged both men with a series of serious felonies: performing unlicensed surgery, conspiracy to commit unlicensed surgery, maiming and assault and battery. The disturbing details, the freezer evidence, the blood-stained surgical tools, the victim's testimony, left little doubt about the gravity of what had taken place. For investigators, this case was almost surreal. It wasn't a quick act of violence or a crime of passion. It was calculated, organized, and ritualistic. Bob Allen had claimed to be helping people, but the evidence suggested he was exploiting vulnerable individuals for his own twisted purposes. During pretrial hearings, Bob continued to deny being a cannibal. He insisted that his comments had been jokes, taken out of context. But when it came to the unlicensed surgery, he had little room to maneuver. The evidence was overwhelming, and his past bragging about other patients raised even more red flags. In the end, Bob entered a plea of no contest. It was a legal move that meant he did not admit guilt, but he also did not fight the charges. As he explained in court, he feared a jury would convict him of far worse crimes if he went to trial. The judge handed down a sentence of 10 years in prison plus an additional 2 years in county jail. Thomas, who had assisted in the operation, also faced felony charges. His role may not have been as central as Bob's, but prosecutors argued he was an active participant in a dangerous and illegal act. The victim, against all odds, made a full recovery. His decision to tell the truth, despite the terrifying threats, not only saved his own life, but may have prevented other potential victims from meeting a much darker fate. But even with justice served, one haunting question lingered. Just how many others had walked into Bob's cabin, never realizing what they were truly stepping into? The story of Bob Lee Allen and Thomas Gates is one of the most twisted cases in recent memory. Not just because of the crime itself, but because of the bizarre mix of consent, deception, and sheer cruelty involved. The victim went searching for something extreme, something outside the boundaries of regulated medicine. But instead of finding someone qualified or safe, he fell into the hands of people who'd blurred the line between obsession and sadism. The chilling part is that this was not a kidnapping or a random attack. He willingly traveled across the country, believing he was in control of what was about to happen. Yet once inside their cabin, all control was gone. Investigators believe Bob and Thomas may have been preparing to carry out similar procedures on others. Bob openly bragged about having more clients waiting their turn. The storage devices and recordings seized from the cabin raised disturbing questions about whether this case was just the tip of the iceberg. Unfortunately, without other victims coming forward, much of that mystery remains unsolved. For the community in Oklahoma, the case shattered the quiet image of rural life. A cabin once advertised on Airbnb as a cozy getaway was revealed to be a crime scene filled with surgical tools, blood-stained equipment, and body parts stored like trophies. Neighbors who may have seen Bob and Thomas as eccentric but harmless suddenly realized they had been living next to something far more sinister. In court, Bob tried to downplay his actions, but his sentence made one thing clear: society would not tolerate his brand of unlicensed surgery or his grotesque threats. 10 years behind bars may not erase the trauma of the victim, but it prevented Bob from luring in more people with promises of underground operations. Looking back, the case stands as a disturbing reminder of how far some will go in the shadows of the internet. Vulnerable people searching for answers, or for extreme changes to their bodies, can fall prey to predators hiding behind screens and false promises. What makes this story unforgettable isn't just the gruesome details. It's the chilling realization that without the courage of one man to speak up, this twisted operation might have continued, hidden in the woods, for years to come.